July 11, 1943. Field Marshal Kessler was absolutely certain he had the Americans exactly where he wanted them. He had their infantry trapped on the beaches of Gala with their backs to the sea. He had the element of surprise. And most importantly, he had the Hermann Göring Division moving into position, spearheaded by the most feared weapon of World War II, the Tiger tank. According to 20 years of military doctrine, the American invasion was doomed. No infantry force in the world could stop a massed panzer assault without heavy artillery support. Kessler prepared to report a decisive victory to Berlin. He expected to throw the Allies back into the ocean before noon. But Kessler was making a fatal calculation error. He thought he was fighting a conventional army. He didn't realize he was facing an entirely new kind of warfare. He was about to lose his elite division, not to enemy tanks, not to enemy aircraft, but to a force that shouldn't have been able to reach him at all. Field Marshal Albert Kessler was 57 years old in the summer of 1943. A veteran of the First World War, one of the most experienced and respected commanders in the entire Wehrmacht, he had risen through the ranks of the Luftwaffe, commanding air fleets during the Battle of Britain in 1940. He had orchestrated the devastating aerial bombardment of Malta that nearly starved the island into submission. He had coordinated Axis operations across the entire Mediterranean theater. More importantly for what was about to happen, Kesselring understood logistics. He understood industrial capacity. He understood what it took to move men and material across vast distances and concentrate force at decisive points. These were not abstract concepts to him. They were the foundations of modern warfare that he had studied and practiced for 3 decades. What he was watching unfold across Sicily on July 10th and 11th, 1943, seemed to exceed everything he thought he understood about military possibility. His intelligence network had tracked the Allied convoys crossing the Mediterranean from North Africa. The reports arriving at his headquarters at Frascati, located in the hills southeast of Rome, contained numbers that appeared to be errors. Surely someone had added an extra zero. Surely the reconnaissance aircraft had miscounted. 3,200 ships.
Not 300. 3,200 vessels of every type. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, tank landing ships, cargo vessels, hospital ships. The largest amphibious fleet ever assembled in the history of warfare. 4,000 aircraft providing cover and support. Not 400, 4,000 fighters, bombers, and transport planes ready to dominate the skies over Sicily. 180,000 soldiers prepared to land in the first wave. Soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. Soldiers equipped with tanks, artillery, trucks, and enough ammunition to fight for weeks without resupply. In 25 years of military service, Kessler had never seen anything approaching this scale. The German invasion of France in 1940, which had conquered Western Europe in 6 weeks, had employed fewer resources. The invasion had begun during the night of July 9, 1943. American and British paratroopers dropped across southeastern Sicily under cover of darkness. High winds scattered them over hundreds of square kilometers. Some landed in the sea and drowned. Others came down kilometers from their intended drop zones. Some units landed so far off target that they spent the first hours of the invasion simply trying to find each other. As a cohesive fighting force, the airborne troops were temporarily scattered and confused. Kessler's staff officers noted this with satisfaction. The report suggested Allied planning had failed at its first test. Kesselring saw his opportunity clearly. The fundamental vulnerability of any amphibious operation was the first 24 hours before heavy weapons could be unloaded, before defensive positions could be established, before the beachhead could be secured against counterattack. Every military theorist understood this. Every commander planned to exploit it. If German armored forces could strike the beachheads before the Americans consolidated their positions, they could split the invasion force, they could drive wedges between the landing beaches, they could push the invaders back into the water before their overwhelming material superiority could be brought to bear. He had seen it happen at Dieppe in August 1942. A combined British and Canadian raid had been annihilated on the beaches in less than 10 hours. The water behind an invasion force was its worst enemy. It allowed no retreat. It offered no cover. It provided no reinforcement route once the landing craft withdrew. With enough pressure applied quickly enough, troops trapped between attacking tanks and the open sea would panic and disintegrate.
This was sound military doctrine. This was how counterattacks against amphibious landings were supposed to work. Kesselring gave the order. The Hermann Göring Division would attack at dawn. The Hermann Göring Division represented everything German military doctrine had perfected over 4 years of war. Originally created from Luftwaffe ground personnel and named for the Reich Marshal himself, it had been rebuilt during 1942 and early 1943 into a first-rate panzer formation. Its soldiers were fanatically loyal to the Nazi regime. Its officers were combat-tested veterans of the Eastern Front. Its training emphasized aggressive action and tactical flexibility. Most importantly, its equipment included the Tiger tank. The Panzer Kampfwagen 6 Tiger was the most feared armored vehicle in the world in 1943. Its frontal armor measured 100 millimeters thick. No Allied tank gun could penetrate it at combat ranges. Its own 88mm main gun, derived from the legendary anti-aircraft weapon, could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. In the hands of experienced crews, a single Tiger could hold an entire road against advancing columns. 17 Tigers led the assault toward Gela on the morning of July 11th. Behind them rolled Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks. Infantry and armored SDKF 251 half-tracks accompanied the armor. The attack force numbered over 4,000 men with more than 200 vehicles. Artillery batteries prepared to provide fire support. The division's reconnaissance units had identified the American positions and the routes of advance. For Kesselring, receiving reports at his headquarters 500 kilometers to the north, this was exactly the scenario he had planned for. Strike hard, strike fast, exploit the chaos of the landing before the Americans could organize their defense. The Hermann Göring Division had the firepower, the training, and the determination to throw the invasion back into the sea. At 6:15, the German columns began moving south across the Gela Plain toward the beaches. The terrain favored the attackers. The Gela Plain was flat agricultural land, perfect for armored operations. The roads, though dusty in the July heat, were adequate for military vehicles. The distance from the German assembly areas to the American perimeter was less than 15 kilometers. At standard advance rates, the Tigers would be among the American positions within 2 hours. German reconnaissance reported weak resistance ahead. The American 1st Infantry Division had landed with minimal armor support. Most of their tanks were still aboard transport ships, waiting to be unloaded. Their artillery batteries were being assembled on the beaches, but were not yet operational. The defensive perimeter extended only 3 kilometers inland from the waterline. Darby's Rangers and infantry companies occupied the town of Gela itself, but they possessed no weapons capable of stopping Tiger tanks at long range. The 37mm anti-tank guns that American infantry units carried were nearly useless against heavy German armor. The conditions for a successful counterattack seemed nearly perfect. Kessler permitted himself cautious optimism as the morning reports arrived. What Kessler could not see from Frascati was the naval task force anchored offshore. What his intelligence had failed to adequately assess was what those ships were capable of delivering. The Americans had not simply landed troops on Sicily, they had positioned a floating artillery platform unlike anything in military history. The Western Naval Task Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt, formed a steel crescent around the invasion beaches. Cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels carried enough firepower to devastate any ground force within 30 kilometers of the coast. USS Savannah, USS Boys, USS Birmingham, USS Brooklyn, USS Philadelphia. These were not merely escort vessels protecting the transports. They were floating gun batteries capable of delivering sustained bombardment at industrial scale. A single Brooklyn-class cruiser like USS Boys carried 152mm guns in 5 triple turrets. Each gun could fire 8 rounds per minute. The ship could put over 100 high-explosive shells onto a target in 60 seconds. Her magazines held enough ammunition for days of continuous combat. Her fire control systems used radar and mechanical computers for accuracy. Even beyond visual range, she could hit targets at 20 kilometers with devastating precision. The destroyers carried 127mm guns, smaller than the cruiser batteries, but faster firing and numerous. Dozens of destroyers surrounded the invasion beaches. Together, they could blanket square kilometers of terrain with explosive steel. The Hermann Göring Division was advancing directly into a kill zone that extended far beyond anything its commanders had anticipated or prepared for. At 8:30, German forward units made contact with American defensive positions on the outskirts of Jala. The Tiger tanks engaged at long range exactly as their training prescribed. Their 88mm guns began systematically destroying American foxholes and machine gun positions. Infantry fell back toward the beaches. Anti-tank rounds bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's frontal armor. For 90 minutes, the counterattack appeared to be succeeding. German armor advanced steadily. American resistance weakened. The beach seemed within reach. Then, the naval guns opened fire. At 9:10, USS Boise received targeting coordinates from shorefire control parties. Naval gunfire liaison officers with the American infantry had been radioing precise locations of the German advance. Now the information was being used. 152mm guns trained inland, elevation adjusted, range calculated by mechanical fire control computers. The first salvo launched with a sound that rolled across the Mediterranean like thunder. The shells landed among the advancing German columns 43 seconds later. For the tank commanders of the Hermann Göring Division, the experience was unlike any combat they had ever encountered. High explosive shells weighing 47 kilograms each began falling from a clear sky. There was no warning. There was no sound of artillery firing that might allow them to take cover. There was simply the sudden, devastating impact of naval ordnance designed to penetrate battleship armor now being used against ground targets. There was no counter-battery fire possible. German artillery could not reach ships 20 kilometers offshore. There was no air support available. The Luftwaffe had been swept from Sicilian skies by overwhelming Allied air superiority. There was no way to engage an enemy that remained invisible beyond the horizon, immune to any weapon the division possessed. Kesselring's headquarters received the first confused reports around 9:30. The counterattack had stalled. Casualties were mounting rapidly. The source of the devastating fire was initially unclear. Some reports mentioned aircraft, others mentioned artillery of impossible caliber. The truth was worse than any of those explanations. On the Jala plain, the reality unfolding was catastrophic for the attackers. USS Savannah joined the bombardment at 9:25. Her 15 guns added another 100 rounds per minute to the steel rain falling on the German columns. Destroyers added their fire. The American ships were not conducting harassing fire. They were conducting a systematic destruction of an armored division. The German advance did not slow gradually. It stopped as if the entire division had driven into an invisible wall of exploding steel. Tiger tanks that had been invulnerable to anything the American infantry could deploy were now burning on the Jela Plain. The naval shells did not need to penetrate their heavy armor directly. Concentrated explosions destroyed tracks and road wheels, immobilizing vehicles that then became stationary targets. Fragments killed exposed commanders and crew members. Near misses detonated ammunition trucks and fuel vehicles. The concussion alone wounded men inside buttoned-up tanks. By 10 o'clock, the Hermann Göring Division had lost 6 of its precious Tiger tanks, not to American armor, not to anti-tank guns, to ships they could not see and could not reach. For Kesselring, the reports arriving throughout the morning painted an incomprehensible tactical picture. His elite division was being destroyed by naval gunfire. Warships were annihilating a mobile armored formation, conducting a fluid ground offensive. This was not how modern warfare was supposed to work. This was not how any warfare had ever worked. Ships bombarded fixed coastal fortifications during amphibious landings. Everyone understood that. Ships provided covering fire while troops crossed beaches. That was their traditional role. But ships did not engage maneuvering panzer divisions in meeting engagements 15 kilometers inland. The ranges involved, the accuracy required, the ammunition expenditure necessary to suppress an entire armored formation. None of it fit within conventional military doctrine, but the Americans were not fighting according to conventional doctrine. Between 9:10 and 11, the Naval Task Force fired over 3,766 shells at targets on the Jela Plain. That single morning's bombardment exceeded the artillery support most German divisions received in an entire month of combat on the Eastern Front, and the ships could maintain this rate of fire indefinitely. Ammunition ships waited offshore with tens of thousands of additional rounds. The industrial capacity of American shipyards had created not just a navy, but a mobile artillery system of continental scale that could be deployed anywhere within range of salt water. The commander of the Hermann Göring Division ordered a tactical withdrawal at 11 o'clock hours. His counterattack had not simply failed, it had been annihilated in less than 4 hours. 10 of his 17 irreplaceable Tiger tanks were destroyed, disabled, or abandoned. Hundreds of his soldiers lay dead and wounded across the Jela Plain. His remaining forces retreated into the hills northwest of the beaches, beyond the effective range of the naval guns. The American beachhead at Jela was secure. The counterattack that should have thrown the invasion into the sea had been crushed by floating firepower from beyond the horizon. Kesselring understood what had happened at Gala with terrible strategic clarity. The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of amphibious warfare. Landing forces were always vulnerable in the critical first hours before heavy weapons could be brought ashore and organized for defense. Every military economy taught this. Every commander since ancient times had planned to exploit this vulnerability. Strike the enemy while he is half landed, half organized, half prepared. But the Americans had eliminated the vulnerability entirely by making their ships into mobile artillery. A cruiser offshore could deliver more firepower than an entire Army artillery regiment. It could do so within minutes of receiving targeting coordinates. It could continue firing for hours without resupply concerns. It could reposition faster than any ground-based battery. And unlike artillery, it could not be captured, overrun, flanked, or destroyed by a ground counterattack. This was not merely a tactical innovation, it was an industrial revolution applied to warfare. Building Brooklyn cruisers required shipyard capacity that Germany simply did not possess. Manning them with trained crews required naval academies and years of development. Supplying them with ammunition required manufacturing output at scales the Axis powers could never match. The shells falling on the Hermann Göring Division represented not just firepower, but an entire economic and industrial system mobilized for total war. Kessler had lost more than 10 Tiger tanks on the Gela Plain. He had lost the strategic initiative in Sicily. The campaign for Sicily continued for another 38 days. But its fundamental outcome was decided on the morning of July 11th. Without the ability to mount successful counterattacks against the beachheads, Kessler could only conduct a fighting withdrawal toward the northeastern corner of the island. The Hermann Göring Division never recovered its offensive capability during the Sicily campaign. Its remaining Tigers were fed into defensive battles piecemeal rather than concentrated for decisive action. American and British forces advanced steadily across Sicily throughout July and early August. Their flanks remained protected by naval guns that could reach 30 kilometers inland. Any German force that masked for counterattack became a target for the floating artillery. Any position that seemed defensible became untenable under naval bombardment. Palermo, the Sicilian capital, fell on July 22nd. Catania, the major city on the eastern coast, fell on August 5th. Messina, at the island's northeastern tip, just 3 kilometers from the Italian mainland, fell on August 17th. Kessler managed one final achievement during the Sicilian disaster. Operation Lehrgang, the evacuation across the Strait of Messina, successfully withdrew over 100,000 German and Italian troops to the Italian mainland between August 11th and August 17th. Using ferries, barges, and small craft under constant Allied air attack, Kesselring's forces escaped to fight another day. He saved his army, but he could not save Sicily, and he could not change the fundamental equation that Gala had revealed about the nature of the war Germany was fighting. The lessons of Gela would repeat across the Mediterranean and eventually across the English Channel. At Salerno in September 1943, German counterattacks against the Allied landings again met devastating naval bombardment. Panzer divisions that tried to push the beachhead into the sea were shattered by cruiser and battleship fire. At Anzio in January 1944, where Allied forces established a beachhead south of Rome, USS Brooklyn alone fired over 4,300 main battery rounds in a single month of combat support. At Normandy in June 1944, the largest amphibious operation in history, naval gunfire would shatter German armored reserves before they could reach the invasion beaches. The 21st Panzer Division, attempting to counterattack on D-Day, encountered the same wall of naval steel that had destroyed the Hermann Göring Division a year earlier on Sicily. Kesselring spent the remainder of the war fighting defensive campaigns in Italy. He built the Gustav Line across the Italian peninsula. He held Monte Cassino for 5 months against repeated Allied assaults. He made the Americans and British pay for every kilometer of Italian soil in blood and time. But he never again attempted to throw an amphibious landing back into the sea. He had learned at Gela what American industrial power meant in practice. He had seen what happened when German courage and tactical skill met American production capacity. The mathematics were impossible to overcome. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years after Sicily. Millions more soldiers and civilians would die. The Nazi regime would fight to the bitter end. But for Kesselring, watching his elite Panzer Division shattered by ships firing from beyond the horizon on July 11, 1943, the ultimate outcome was already becoming clear. Germany was not fighting an army. Germany was fighting a production system, a system that could build cruisers faster than Germany could build tanks, a system that could manufacture shells faster than Germany could train soldiers, a system that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. And production systems do not tire, they do not break, they do not lose their nerve under pressure. They simply continue producing until the enemy has nothing left to fight with. The 17 Tiger tanks burning on the Jella Plain were not just a tactical loss, they were a glimpse of Germany's future. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the forgotten stories of World War II, the moments where individual courage met industrial reality, and the discoveries that changed the course of history. Where are you watching from today? What other stories from World War II would you like us to cover? Let us know in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important historical accounts to life. Until next time.